For nearly a century, Australia has been fighting a silent war. Not a war fought with weapons or armies, but one waged in shadows, in wetlands, in the dead of night. A war where the enemy doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, and doesn't even seem to understand that it's winning. But what if I told you, the enemy wasn't just unstoppable, it was almost perfectly designed to win? And even more unsettling, what if the answer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time? How could something so small defeat what millions of dollars, decades of research, and countless failed strategies could not? To understand that, we have to go back. Back to a single decision. A decision that seemed harmless, even logical. And yet, it changed everything. The decision that changed everything. It was 1935. In the humid fields of Queensland, sugarcane farmers stood helpless as their crops were slowly being destroyed. Beneath the surface, beetles gnawed at the roots, crippling entire harvests before they even had a chance to grow. For the farmers, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was survival. Families depended on these crops. Entire communities relied on the success of the harvest. And every failed season meant mounting debt, uncertainty, and fear. So when scientists proposed a solution, it felt like hope. Introduce a natural predator. A species that could hunt the beetles, reduce their numbers, and restore balance. That species, the cane toad. Only 101 of them were released into the wild. Just 101. At the time, it didn't feel like a risk. These toads had been used elsewhere in the world. They were seen as a biological tool, efficient, controlled, purposeful. But here's the question no one truly stopped to ask. What happens when you introduce a species into an ecosystem that never evolved to handle it? Because nature doesn't operate on intention. It operates on consequence. A plan that failed. Instantly. The problem revealed itself almost immediately. The beetles lived high on the sugarcane stalks. The toads stayed on the ground. They never even crossed paths. The solution had missed its target entirely. But something far more dangerous had already begun. Because while the toads ignored the beetles, Australia did not ignore the toads. It welcomed them. A warm climate. Abundant food. No predators willing to take the risk. For the cane toads, it was paradise. And in paradise, survival becomes expansion. So here's a chilling question. What happens when a species doesn't just survive, but thrives beyond control? The perfect invader. The answer came faster than anyone expected. Cane toads reproduce at a rate that borders on unimaginable. A single female can lay up to 30,000 eggs in one season. Not once, but multiple times. Picture that for a moment. Thousands becoming tens of thousands, becoming millions, becoming hundreds of millions. Now ask yourself, how do you stop something that multiplies faster than you can count it? Within decades, those original 101 toads spread across vast regions of Australia. Rivers, forests, grasslands, nothing slowed them down. But what made it worse was that they weren't just spreading. They were adapting. At the front lines of the invasion, something strange was happening. The toads were changing. Longer legs, stronger bodies, greater endurance. They were evolving, becoming faster, more efficient, more capable of pushing deeper into new territory. In other words, the invasion was learning how to win. A weapon no one could counter. But speed wasn't their greatest strength. It was their defense. Cane toads carry a powerful toxin in glands behind their eyes. When threatened, they release it, a milky poison capable of shutting down a predator's heart within minutes. Snakes died. Lizards died. Even crocodiles, ancient survivors of millions of years, fell after a single bite. Think about that. Animals that had ruled ecosystems for ages, wiped out by one mistake. In some regions, predator populations dropped by over 90%. Entire food chains began to collapse. And that raises a deeper question. What happens to nature when its balance is suddenly broken? The answer is chaos. Prey species multiply unchecked. Insects surge in overwhelming numbers. Vegetation patterns change. Ecosystems that took millions of years to stabilize begin to unravel in just decades. Australia wasn't just facing an invasive species. It was facing ecological collapse. Decades of failure. Scientists tried everything. Traps, fences, poisons, biological controls. Each solution came with hope and ended in disappointment. The toads kept coming. They crossed barriers. They adapted to new environments. They resisted control measures. It began to feel like the fight was unwinnable. And so the question lingered, year after year. Is there any way to stop something that seems unstoppable? The unexpected observation. The breakthrough didn't come from a high-tech lab. It didn't come from a billion-dollar research program. It came from watching. Quietly. Carefully. At the edges of ponds, where young toads emerged from the water, scientists began to notice something unusual. Tiny toads, barely larger than a coin, were dying. Not from disease. Not from predators they expected. But from something far smaller. Ants. At first, it didn't make sense. How could ants, creatures so small, so fragile, attack something so toxic? And even more puzzling, why weren't they dying? This question changed everything. The weakness no one saw. The answer lay deep within biology. Cane toad toxin is deadly to vertebrates, animals with backbones. It disrupts their heart function, shuts down their systems, and leads to rapid death. But ants? Ants aren't vertebrates. Their bodies work differently. Their systems don't react to the toxin in the same way. To them, the poison isn't lethal. It's meaningless. And their method of attack? It's not a single bite. It's a swarm. Hundreds. Sometimes thousands. Moving together like a living wave. Now consider this carefully. What happens when a creature relies entirely on poison for defense, but faces an enemy completely immune to it? It loses its advantage. Completely. Nature's brutal mismatch. The most vulnerable stage of a cane toad's life is just after it leaves the water. These young toads, called metamorphs, are small, weak, and slow. They gather in dense numbers near the water's edge, unable to travel far. And when threatened, they freeze. That instinct works against many predators. Staying still can mean survival. But against ants? It's a death sentence. The ants don't hesitate. They swarm over the toads, biting relentlessly. The toads don't fight back. They can't. Within minutes, the ground becomes a silent battlefield. And here's the question that changes everything. Could something this small be the key to stopping something this massive? A new way of thinking. For decades, the approach had been to fight the toads directly. Kill them. Trap them. Control them. But what if that was the wrong strategy all along? What if the answer wasn't to attack the toads, but to exploit their weakness? Scientists began to experiment. Not with poisons or barriers, but with behavior. Could they guide young toads into areas where ants were active? Could they use natural predators, not immune ones, but overlooked ones, to control populations? Early results were promising. In areas where ants were abundant, survival rates of young toads dropped dramatically. Not by a little, but by a lot. Suddenly, there was hope. The cane toad invasion has always raised a terrifying question. How do you stop something that seems unstoppable? For decades, the answer looked painfully simple. You do not. You watch it spread. You watch it multiply. You watch it move across the landscape like a living stain, leaving behind a trail of ruined ecosystems, broken food chains, and frustrated scientists who could only slow the damage, never truly reverse it. But then something remarkable happened. A solution emerged from a place no one expected. Not from a supercomputer. Not from a massive government project. Not from a chemical designed to erase the problem overnight. It came from patience, observation, and a tiny creature most people would never think twice about. An ant. And that leads us to the bigger question. How did a small insect become one of the few effective weapons against one of nature's most stubborn invasions? The story begins with the cane toad itself, a creature that arrived in Australia in 1935 wrapped in optimism and ignorance. At the time, it was introduced as a solution. Farmers and officials hoped it would control beetles that were damaging sugarcane crops. On paper, It sounded clever, practical, efficient. But nature does not reward shortcuts, and it certainly does not forgive mistakes made without understanding the full picture. The cane toad did not solve the problem it was meant to fix. Instead, it became the problem. Free from the predators and ecological checks that would have kept it in balance in its native environment, it spread aggressively. It reproduced in staggering numbers, adapted quickly, and moved into new areas with alarming speed. What was meant to be a helpful biological control turned into one of the most notorious invasive species disasters in history. And once an invasion like that takes hold, the scale becomes almost impossible to process. We are not talking about a few isolated toads in a corner of the bush. We are talking about millions upon millions of animals spreading across vast distances, year after year, generation after generation. Every adult female capable of producing enormous numbers of eggs. Every rainy season offering another wave of growth. Every new habitat becoming another foothold in a relentless march forward. So the real question is not whether cane toads are harmful. That has already been answered. The real question is whether anything can truly contain them. For a long time, people tried the obvious solutions. Trapping, hunting, removing them by hand, public campaigns, local cleanups. None of it was enough. At best, these efforts made small dents. At worst, they became exhausting symbols of how little control people had over the situation. Because this was never just a problem of numbers. It was a problem of scale. How do you stop a species that multiplies so quickly and spreads so far? How do you protect native animals from a toxic invader that poisons predators simply by being eaten? How do you save ecosystems when the damage moves faster than the response? For years, those questions hung over the people studying the invasion. And then, almost by accident, the answer began to emerge from one of the simplest patterns in nature. Scientists and local observers noticed something strange. When cane toads were still in their earliest and most vulnerable stage, as tiny hatchlings moving toward land, they faced a danger far greater than most people had realized. Not from humans. Not from large predators. From ants. Native ants, especially when concentrated in large numbers, could overwhelm baby toads before they had a chance to establish themselves on land. The young toads were small, soft, slow, and easy to attack. What looked like a minor nuisance turned out to be a deadly weakness. And suddenly, the story changed. If baby cane toads could be killed before they reached adulthood, then the invasion could be interrupted at its most fragile point. Not after they had spread. Not after they had grown. Not after they had begun laying the eggs that would fuel the next wave. But right at the beginning. Is there anything more powerful than stopping a problem before it matures? Nature had already shown the weakness. Scientists simply had not been looking closely enough. Meanwhile, native frogs, species that had evolved alongside ants for millions of years, seemed to understand the threat instinctively. They did not freeze. They did not panic. They jumped. A quick escape, a burst of movement, and they were gone. They had learned, through long experience, that survival was not always about brute force. Sometimes survival was about recognizing danger early and reacting fast. That brings up one of the most important questions in the entire story. Is survival really about strength, or is it about adaptation? Because the cane toad had strength in abundance. It had numbers. It had endurance. It had the ability to spread. But it lacked the right response. It did not have the defenses that would make it untouchable in every environment. And that weakness, once discovered, opened the door to something new. The next step was to turn that observation into strategy. Once scientists understood how vulnerable the young toads were, they needed a way to increase the ants' presence exactly where and when it mattered most. The approach they developed was simple enough to sound almost unbelievable. They used bait. Specifically, cat food. Why cat food? Because ants are drawn to protein, and protein-rich bait could attract them in huge numbers. By placing bait near pond edges, researchers could gather thousands of ants at the precise locations where baby cane toads were likely to emerge. This was not random. It was targeted, timed, and based on a deep understanding of behavior. The ants were not being forced to do something unnatural. They were being invited to do exactly what nature had already equipped them to do. And then came the moment that changed everything. Imagine the scene, a pond edge at night or in the early hours, the air damp and still, the ground alive with movement. Tiny toads begin to emerge from the water, fragile and exposed. Nearby, a concentrated mass of ants waits. Not one, not 10, thousands. And all of them are hungry. What happens next? The results were astonishing. In controlled areas, over 98% of young toads were eliminated within minutes. Not weakened. Not delayed. Eliminated. That number matters because each baby toad was more than just one individual animal. Each one represented a future adult capable of producing tens of thousands of eggs. In other words, killing the young did not just solve today's problem. It prevented tomorrow's catastrophe from ever being born. This is where the entire approach becomes so powerful. It was not about fighting the invasion head-on in the most dramatic way possible. It was about identifying the bottleneck, the point of greatest weakness, and using that vulnerability to interrupt an entire life cycle. And that raises another question. Why did it take so long to notice? Part of the answer is simple. Invasions create noise. When a species spreads rapidly across a continent, it becomes easy to focus on the visible threat, the adult animals, the damage they cause, the aftermath. But by the time the damage is visible, the deeper opportunity may already have been missed. The ants were always there. The cane toads were always vulnerable in their early stages. Yet without intervention, the ants did not appear in the right concentrations at the right moments to make a large enough difference. Nature had the tools, but not the coordination. Scientists changed that by assisting the process rather than inventing something entirely new. That distinction matters. Because this was not about introducing a new invasive species. It was not about spraying a chemical over the landscape and hoping for the best. It was not about imposing a large, blunt solution on a complex system. In fact, that kind of thinking is exactly how the cane toad disaster began in 1935. Instead, the new method asked a quieter, smarter question. What is already here, and how can we use it better? That is a very different way of thinking. In the past, environmental problems were often approached with the idea that bigger meant better. More force. More technology. More intervention. More control. But ecosystems do not always respond well to force. They are dynamic, interdependent, and full of hidden relationships that become obvious only after something has gone wrong. So what if the answer is not adding more? What if the answer is paying closer attention? In the cane toad story, the solution was not hidden because it was non-existent. It was hidden because people overlooked it. The key was already in the environment, waiting to be understood. And when it was finally put into practice, the results began to hint at something far larger than a single pest control tactic. In areas where this method has been used across multiple seasons, signs of recovery have begun to appear. Predators that had vanished are starting to return. Monitor lizards are showing up again in places where they had become rare. Native marsupials are being seen where they had once disappeared. These are not signs of total victory. No one is claiming the ecosystem is healed. It is not. But they are signs of movement in the right direction. They are signs that the damage is not necessarily permanent. They are signs that when the pressure on an ecosystem is reduced, life can begin to push back. And that creates another question, one that matters far beyond the cane toad invasion. Can we truly reverse damage that took decades to unfold? Or is restoration always going to be slow, partial, and uncertain? The honest answer is that recovery takes time. Sometimes far more time than the original damage. But even slow recovery matters. Even partial recovery matters. Because ecosystems are not machines that snap back with a single fix. They are living networks. When one piece begins to heal, other pieces can follow. That is why this story is so important. The cane toad invasion is not over. It may never be completely erased. The species is deeply established, widely spread, and extraordinarily difficult to eliminate entirely. But for the first time in nearly 90 years, scientists have found a method that works in a meaningful way, not by brute force, but by understanding the system at a deeper level. And perhaps that is the real lesson hiding inside the story. Every prevented toad is not just one less invader on the ground. It is the erasure of thousands, maybe millions, of future offspring that will never hatch. It is a cut in the chain. A pause in the spread. A moment where the invasion fails to gain momentum. That is what makes the solution so elegant. It does not need to destroy everything. It only needs to stop the next wave. So now, think about this. What if the greatest solutions to our biggest problems are not always created in laboratories or designed with the latest technology? What if some of them are discovered by simply observing what is already happening around us? What if the answer has been there all along, quietly waiting at the edge of a pond, hidden in the behavior of an insect and the weakness of an invasive species? Sometimes the most powerful solution is not loud. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not look impressive at first glance. It is small, quiet, easy to miss, and it is often hiding where no one thought to look. So the next time you hear about a problem that seems impossible to solve, ask yourself this: are we fighting the right way, or are we looking in the wrong place? Because in the cane toad invasion, the breakthrough was not a bigger weapon. It was a smaller one. And sometimes, that is all it takes to change the course of a story nearly a century in the making.